As the Parisian masses gather in the plaza at the foot of Notre Dame's western facade, the Archdeacon of the cathedral, Monsignor Claude Frollo, whispers to the bound Roma Esmeralda, offering to save her from execution if she agrees to spend the rest of her life with him. Rebuffed, Frollo turns to the crowd and sentences her to death, declaring her a witch and a danger to every citizen of the city. And as the sun sets, he leans down and ignites the kindling beneath her feet, promising her an eternity in the flames of hell. And as this travesty unfolds, Quasimodo, the hunchback of Notre Dame, sympathetic to her plight, watches in pain, chained to the pillars of the basilica, screaming into the wind. But then, inspired by his conscience, stirred by his indignation, enraged, incensed, inflamed by the moral abomination, he musters the strength to tear the chains from his skin, rappel down the stone, and swing to the stake to save Esmeralda. With her in his arms, he repels the archdeacon's guards and dives back toward the cathedral, where he climbs to the terrace and calls out to the cheering crowd, "Sanctuary! Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" And in this moment, where Victor Hugo invites us to contrast moral and visual monstrosities, it is the so-called deformed figure who radiates sympathy, justice, and valor. And it is the cathedral that serves as the refuge for the accused, protecting the innocent from death and offering them shelter and safe harbor. And though this tale is fiction, it reflects medieval law, where houses of worship as sacred spaces were islands of peace in a sea of violence and places of asylum in a world of vice. The cathedral was a haven from grief and pain and malice and war. In short, it was a sanctuary. And though this was canon law first decreed in 511 by the Council of Orleans under the auspices of the Merovingian dynasty, the practice of sanctuary traces its way back to the ancient world. Servius Grammaticus, a pagan historian, claimed in 390 that it was the sons of Hercules in Greece and Romulus in Italy who first established temples as asylums and capital punishment. Elizabeth Allen, in her work on the subject, points to similar conceptions of protection offered by sacred spaces in a whole range of ancient cultures, from Japan to Hawaii and Morocco. And in particular, it was in England that the practice became ubiquitous through the Middle Ages, with a whole system of rituals associated with asylum until James I abolished it in 1623. There were special markers to cordon off the boundaries of a sanctuary inside which a fugitive could not be touched. There were special door knockers that, if touched by an outlaw, offered them safe harbor, and there were designated seats, sitting in which granted anyone protection from retribution or law, called frithstalls, meaning seats of freedom. Which leads us to an astonishing law that we read in shul this morning that puts Jewish thought at odds with this long history of seeing sacred spaces as places of refuge. After describing the regulations around servitude and the penalty for homicide, Moshe notes before the people that someone guilty of murder may not, under any circumstances, seek refuge in the sanctuary. In his unequivocal words, citing God, Moshe says, "Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut," you shall take him away from my altar to be put to death. And this is my question. Why, unlike the rest of the ancient world, did our law refuse to see the sanctuary as a place of refuge? Why does the Torah insist that neither the tabernacle nor the temple provide shelter to those who seek asylum? And so pervasive was this practice that the Torah repudiates that one of King David's generals made the mistake of thinking that the altar would protect him. After siding with the wrong son to inherit David's throne and resisting the rightful reign of Solomon, Yoav fled to the sanctuary for safety, v'yachazek b'karnot hamizbeach, and he grabbed onto the corners of the altar. But on being informed, Shlomo HaMelech is unfazed and simply says, Lech, pagabo, go and strike him down. So again, why does the Torah refute the notion of refuge, so prevalent in the practices of the ancient world, so emotive in the novels of the modern world, where sacred spaces are seen as places of peace and beyond the reach of violence and penalty? And there are two answers to this question that emerge among our commentators that I'd like to share with you today. And the first is found in the words of Rabbeinu Bachya, who seems to reflect a profound objection to the whole institution of the species of asylum, where compassion serves as a camouflage for cruelty. In his words, Ein ra'ui lachmol l'rachem alav, it is improper to show compassion or mercy here. Kerachmanut b'makom hazeh, for mercy in this case, achzariot hu, is akin to cruelty. For Rabbeinu Bachya, the Torah objects to the usage of the sanctuary for absolute immunity in ways that pagans used their temples and the medievals used their churches, because clemency to killers is cruelty to victims. To shield the guilty from their sentence is indeed a form of compassion, but when that guilt reflects another's grief, that grace is a disservice to those already in pain. And to some degree, it is precisely that sentiment, partnered with a pragmatic concern, that led kings, parliaments, and popes to reach the common conclusion in the 16th century that protecting sanctuary seekers presents a threat to civil society. It became the consensus that the kind of sanctuary celebrated in Notre Dame was a public nuisance. It was both costly to civilized community and served as an invitation to delinquency. It was, in the words of one historian, a system in which the strong and the swift could cheat the gallows. But there is another objection to the philosophy of pagan sanctuary found in the comments of an Italian exegete, Rav Ovadia Sforno, who traces his opposition back to the age of the prophets and a complaint made by Jeremiah, who, on seeing the corruption of the kahuna and the transformation of the temple hierarchy into a racket for greedy priests, Yirmiyahu calls out in the name of God and says, Haganov, Ratzoach, Vena'of, Hishavel Leshaker. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery and lie? Uvatem v'amadatem lefanai, and then come and stand before me, b'bayit hazeh, in this house? Hama'arat pratzim haya habayit hazeh be'einechem. Is this house in your eyes a den of thieves? Because beyond the unkindness that clemency to killers can be toward victims and their families, there is something more universal at stake for the Sforno, and that is the role that sacred spaces play in society. Pagans saw their sanctuaries, as we said at the start, as islands of peace in a sea of violence and places of asylum in a world of vice. For them, the world is a dark place, filled with malice and betrayal and untruths, and the sanctuary is a refuge, a retreat for anyone who seeks shelter. But in Jewish thought, the temple is not a shelter from evil, it is a beacon of light. Our sacred spaces are not havens from an otherwise inescapable pain, they are platforms for healing the world's wounds. We refuse to concede that evil is inevitable or pain is inexorable, that material life is simply rife with malice and sin. And for the Sforno, to allow the temple or the tabernacle to serve as a sanctuary for fugitives would be to concede that sin is unassailable and that the only escape is the embrace of a sacred space, which is an island without the power to fight the tides of a wayward world. For the Sforno, Our sanctuaries are not modeled on Noah's Ark, and we do not see the world as terminally, hopelessly, irredeemably dark. Our duty is to embark on a mission to shed our sanctuary's light beyond its borders, to participate in building society, in keeping its laws, in protecting the innocent, and yes, punishing the guilty. The whole of this morning's parasha is dedicated to teaching us that we are duty-bound as a nation to build a civilization that offers people peace and prosperity and meaning, and not to hide behind temple walls from the challenges that nation building tends to bring. And if our sanctuary shielded the guilty, we and our priests would be complicit in impeding our mission to cure the world of its diseases. Our view of sacred space is not as an asylum, but as a base of operations to change the world, and our view of sacred time is the same. So I pray that we can all find ways to harness what was today, Shabbat, when many of us are in a sacred space on a sacred day, not only as a means to flee the pressures of the week and the world, but as an opportunity to recharge so we can face the coming week and the rest of the world with the hope that we can fill it with light. I wish you all a Shavua Tov.